So I've been gone for about 2 years, but I'm back and I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. As some of you can guess by the new channel name, I'm going to start doing videos on Warhammer lore, which is fitting as the only thing I hate more than Warhammer lore channels is myself. I originally was going to jump right in with a video on one of the ruinous powers. I even ran a poll on my Twitter to choose which one, and it got a 4-way tie, and so I complained about it. Then it got a 3-way tie, so yeah, I'm not going to do that. No, none of them are going to get it. So I'm not going to talk about any of that today. Instead, I'm going to be talking about the planets of the Imperium. I had like a whole script somewhere on my computer, but I can't even find it at this point. So for those who, have the intelligence of the average Imperial citizen, planets of the Imperium are planets within the Imperium of Man. It's kind of self-explanatory. I don't know why I need to explain that part, but there's a lot of misconceptions over the planets of the Imperium. If you ask the average person who's never played Warhammer before at all what a planet of the Imperium of Man looks like, they'd probably go,
I know, it's like a planet with people in it or whatever.
If you ask the average Warhammer fan, they'd probably be like,
it's a brutal authoritarian police state where human lives don't matter and everyone is sad.
Yeah, so the average person is actually more right on this than the Warhammer person, because like I said, within the hobby there's a lot of misconceptions on planets. One of the main things is just the overall quality of life. A lot of times in Warhammer lore we see a lot of planets that just are not really good at all and are, pretty downright miserable, but they're actually the exception to the norm, not necessarily the norm in the Imperium. And a lot of planets are actually pretty decent, some of which are even better than like modern Earth in relative comparison. I mean modern like M2, not M42 Earth. And this is kind of exciting just because there's well over 1 million inhabited planets and there's not really a lot of oversight from the central Imperium of Man. Most planets are free to do pretty much whatever they want except for like 3 simple things, because they just need to follow a few rules put in place by the Imperium of Man. The first and the most obvious one, which is the one you'll probably hear the most about, will be paying tithe to the Imperium of Man. So planets within the Imperium of Man are expected to basically pay back what they get from the Imperium of Man, being protection, technology, and resources that they can't have on their own planet, as well as the administrative oversight, and also because the Imperium of Man believes that every planet's indebted to them because God Emperor. So planets are expected to basically pay back in some way, and this could be food, or weapons, manufactured goods, or even just soldiers. And the Imperium is pretty indifferent on what they get as long as it's something useful. So whatever your planet has a surplus of, you can basically get it and not have to worry about angry people showing up demanding, rent. And the second is having a planetary governor. This is pretty much just for the ease of oversight, because the Imperium, when they need to contact a planet, like if there's a major defensive over a couple systems, they need someone that they can go to and dial up and basically coordinate that planet with. So when they have concerns, they want someone that they can basically hold responsible, and they want someone that they can contact when they need tithes and so on. This is really just so they can basically have a way to communicate with the planet, and this is why they need the planetary government, for the ease of communication. And the third is just holding the Imperial Creed. The Imperial Creed gets a pretty bad rap because of planets like Shrine Worlds. These planets will normally follow the Imperial Creed to extreme levels, and also, on more scary parts of the books that aren't really enforced overall and will literally burn people in the streets over theocratic differences. But for a lot of the Imperium, the Imperial Creed takes a lot less plays a much smaller role in their life. It's like they'll still attend their churches or church equivalent and still abide by it, but they won't be raging zealots. And in those populations, when raging zealots do pop up, they don't tend to last long, since they'll usually gather into groups and then head out on pilgrimages, just basically leaving the planet behind and going to places like the Shrine Worlds where all the really crazy religious individuals are, so you don't really have to worry about them as much. Although occasionally you will get things like a Underhive gang that is extremely religious and can't afford to basically leave everyone else alone by flying off into space, so you do have to deal with them lighting people on fire. Like I said, these aren't really that much of an issue. Now that we have all the stuff that the Imperial planets hold in common, we can discuss why there's this massive misconception over the quality of life on the planets. And it's actually really simple. It has to do with selection bias. So most planets that we hear about in Warhammer are about either through campaigns, so planets like being invaded, attacked in some other way, or being seized by the Imperium. So generally the planet's going to be pretty bad because there's a significant force for a campaign. There's literally armies on it, which means it's going to be wartime, which means that there's going to be less resources going towards public good, or the place isn't going to be as good overall because, it's being destroyed. So the planet's just going to be awful in general. Or the planet's the location of a specialist game. So either people are running around with no accountability, murdering each other like in Necromunda, where it's complete gang warfare and anarchy, or it's going to be like Kill Team, which means that we're right back at a campaign again. So there's going to be a massive war, and you're just doing special ops for it. So once again, it's going to be a horrible planet for the aforementioned reasons why campaign's bad. Or the last reason, and the main reason why I actually see individual planets, is because the planet is a source of a guard regiment. So planets with guard regiments tend to be more awful than your average Imperial planet, just for the simple fact that their most viable export is soldiers, which means that they don't really have good ore, they don't have good farming stuff, they don't have anything of value except for their people. Or when they do have stuff of value, the people are more valuable because of how bad that planet is. And this is what we see with Catachan, like it has excellent lumber and excellent ore. The planet is just so hostile to being settled, and the population is so small that they can't really functionally get any of the other resources. But through this, the people themselves become way more valuable since they are survival experts, and they have the exact same armor, safe despite not wearing armor, when you compare them to a Cadian. So because of this, we hear about planets that are just really unforgiving and basically kill a massive percent of their population, usually death worlds, but it can also just be other factors that are killing the people in them, which then results in these guard being survivable, since you don't really hear that much about worlds that pay other types of tithes, just because it's not as interesting. You're not painting an army of crops, painting an army of soldiers. So you're always going to be hearing about planets that have guard regiments. Or thanks to this focus of lore on guard regiment planets, we can also get some perspective on what these planets were like before they started exploring guard regiments, to see what your average non-guard exploring planet was like. A few good examples of this are Krieg, Tanith, and Valhalla. So Krieg, at least to old lore before they started releasing new books, which I haven't read yet, but from what I hear they don't conflict with the old lore too much, save for the origin of the nukes, but I'm not going to get into that. It's completely irrelevant for this discussion, and I don't want to hear about it in the comments. So Krieg was implied to be a democratic hive planet that was pretty good overall, like better than modern living standards. It wasn't like your Necromunda type hive, it actually seemed to be well maintained and well built. It had good exports with a large middle class, and the nobles overall weren't that bad, and probably because it was democratic. And there wasn't any, zealotry or insanity, but basically this planet was doing very well and didn't have any adversity at all. And at one point they got tired of paying tithes. It was unknown but assumed not to be soldiers, and they basically chose to secede from the Imperium, which then caused the planetary PDF, which became the modern day Krieg, to basically get pretty miffed overall and seize nuclear weapons and destroy the planet, which means that the modern Krieg are basically the descendants of domestic terrorists, which is, probably not that nice when you look at it. But yeah, so basically the planet was pretty good, and then it nuked itself into oblivion, which completely destroyed most of the stuff of value there. Like, even though it was a hive world, it was kind of like bordering on a paradise world, which we'll get into later. They completely destroyed everything of value there except for the people, and of course going through 500 years of radiated trench warfare basically gave anyone survived. Most of them died obviously because 500 years, but basically created a culture which generated very strong valuable warriors, which is why they're so popular and so desired in the Astra Militarum. Next is Tanith. Unlike the other two planets that I mentioned as case studies, this one was always exploring guard regiments. It also, I think, explored lumber and other stuff. It was kind of weird. I think it might have had talking trees. Some of the backstory gets really weird on some of these planets, but basically this planet was pretty good. It was pretty decent. It was just basically a giant forest world with some hive cities, but most people just run around in the forest being lumberjacks or hunters or whatever else, just doing fun stuff for sport until Chaos showed up and blew the entire place to bits. Third is Valhalla. This one was also a nice planet. Unfortunately, unlike the other two, it doesn't really have any lore from the before times, but they seem to hold the times before everything went horrible to good regards. I don't see anything implying that they had a large guard presence before then, so I think they might have done other exports like lumber or crops, since this one was a paradise world. Once again, we'll get into that designation later. The only time that stuff actually started going wrong was when they were hit with an asteroid knocked out of orbit, turning into the Frozen Nightmare of this day, which completely changed the culture. kill the majority of the population, obviously, and turn the rest to a pretty bitter and cold people, which made them perfect for the Astral Charm, because, you know, it also destroyed any resource that they could have been exploring except for, like, ice. That's pretty much, like, the only other thing they have, and they do pay their tithes to the soldiers. And it's also pretty common once you get into space, just because, like, comets and asteroids and all that. Yeah, so the point of going through these 3 case studies were to show that planets that don't export guard can actually be pretty chill and pretty good. Like, out of the 3 case studies, only Tanith produced guard, and all 3 of them were really good place to live, arguably modern day or better than modern day living standards. And there wasn't really adversity or issues until there was an inciting issue like, you know, Greek Revolution from seceding, an asteroid, or just chaos showing up to be jerks that really caused this issue. And also, this shows how planets can just sort of go completely under the view of the fanbase. Like, you're not going to learn about a planet that's just a democratic hive city where everyone's happy and there's no conflict. You're not going to hear about that in Warhammer because there's no conflict, and Warhammer lore is built on conflict. Alright, so now I'm going to get into planet categories. So, long story short, planet categories are a mess, and I think they need to be revised, but what I'm going to read off are the official category types, even though some of them are kind of overlapping and some of them just really shouldn't be in the same things, and I'll touch on those as we go. So first for the categories, we have agri-worlds. These are the breadbasket of Imperium. These planets mostly pay tithes in food, and you don't really hear about them at all. Most of them are just like, well, basically just rural planets where they just grow crops like modern day style. There's some that are a bit more like advanced, like we have whole hydroponic plants, which is giant factories growing plants, although those are rare. We also have some where it's just plant-sized fishing, plant-sized ranching. And then really rarely there was one that was, there's some really weird ones. Like there's this one gas giant that exports airborne plankton, but like I said, that's rare, and I think there's only like one of those that is even ever mentioned in lore, and most of these planets are pretty calm and pretty chill. Like, you're going to have modern day living standards, so you're not going to have a lot of nice technology, but you're not really going to be harassed or bugged at all that much. Although if you do go pretty bad, like, there's some that do go full rural India, poisoning their citizens with fertilizer and pesticides. But those are also a minority. Most seem to be pretty good from the lore given. The only time they really ever see action is when they're attacked by Drukhari, who are just basically going out of their cracked den of a pocket dimension to restock on party essentials. And, like, that's the only time you ever hear about is when the creepy elves show up.
No, they have the knife ears.
Honestly, if you were in the Warhammer universe, you'd want to be a farmer. Your best chance of having a decent full life would just be living here, because everywhere else is going to be way more risk and way more of a chance of conflict, because everyone except the knife eaters don't really go to these planets just because there's no real opposition on them and no really fighting. I mean, I guess Tyranids would like these, but with how Tyranids are, I mean, okay, yeah, Tyranids would eat these, but they're not going to outright target these worlds over other ones. The only people that are actually going to be targeting these worlds will be like the knife eaters, like I said. Next up are hive worlds. These are, honestly, this is kind of a sticking point. So a hive world is a world covered in hive cities. Mind you, non-hive world planets do have hive cities. In fact, most planets do have a hive city, since hive cities are the easiest way to basically have a void port, and it tends to be the center of trade and bureaucracy for a planet. The hive worlds are just planets completely covered in massive mountain-sized cities that can reach up into low orbit. These tend to be built up over a dozen thousand at most, probably like a couple thousand most of them. Like, you could probably build one relatively fast, but you're still going to be like 1,000 years at minimum, because you're just stacking up so much stuff over and over, building infrastructure until you get up to low orbit, where it takes a lot of time and resource to build these. And a lot of these are their foundations used to be old Golden Age of technology settlements, so they're like 10,000 years old each, for at least the bigger and older ones. And we especially see this with like Van Sar. It's literally a Golden Age ship, although admittedly the Golden Age colony ship did get lost in the warp for a while and crash after the War of Men and Iron in the Golden Age, which is why it has such an intact STC. The point is, they're extremely old, and most of them are older than the Imperium of Man itself in its modern concept. And these planets also do tend to, basically because of tens of thousands of years of neglect and misuse and being built on top, they tend to be pretty unstable, collapsing. A common phenomenon on hive worlds is literally hive quakes, where it's earthquakes, except it's not actually an earthquake because it's just something farther down or farther up in the hive collapsing and basically shaking the whole thing, risking further collapses. It's very not good. Hive worlds also tend to be pretty stratified. At the lowest of the lowest levels, there will be like mutants and hive scum and like basically homeless people, but somehow worse than homeless, and just the complete rejects of the society that can't live at the upper parts. And these parts will usually be full of like pollution and collapsing tunnels, and it's going to be really cramped and uncomfortable and extremely unhealthy to live in with the amounts of pollution. Then when you get above that to the lower hive, and this is going to be a little bit more the same, but it's improved slightly. It's going to be a bit more big and open. There might be some industry at this level, like foundries, and the entire area is probably going to be controlled by gangs or different gang-like groups. Even if it's not a gang in the traditional sense, it will still probably function like a gang, and people will be divided into different groups and clans based on different things. Like in Necromunda, we have House Goliath, and they basically control the foundries in lower areas. Then we have Esker. There's a gang that controls that basically produce pharmaceuticals and stuff, and then like inside that there's still like houses that are an issue where it's like houses and guilds. Like the Water Guild, like they're not a gang in the traditional sense, but they still like function like a gang. And they have, focus on the there's just water. And then we get to the middle hive. This is the part that's not really talked about at all because people like to focus on the extremes. But it seemed to be like the sort of middle class, like bureaucratic people and white-collar jobs, basically people who do all of the just stuff you don't hear about, like the paperwork, imports, exports, all that. They basically are the things that make the hive city productive. Like, I mean, yeah, the lower hive will do manufacturing sometimes, but it's the middle hive that makes sure that stuff gets out, gets sold, gets moved in. And this is also where the biggest Arbite presence is. We occasionally see the Arbites in the lower hive, but they're pretty rare. And the reason is because they're mostly in the middle hive. And then we have the upper hive, which is arguably the worst part. So this part will usually be extremely fancy and decorative, everything marble clad, despite the fact that you're on these massive teetering spires that could fall over, so you really don't want to add a bunch of weight to them, but the people are rich, they're doing whatever they want, so it doesn't really matter. We all see the exports here because these are parts in low orbit where basically ships can dock without having to go into atmosphere. Well, they do kind of. It's confusing. There's a lot of contradictions around this, but this is where the Hive Nobles are, which are basically we ever played Dwarf Fortress? These are the nobles, and they're just as incompetent and horrible and annoying as Dwarf Fortress nobles. They will be banning exports of socks and doing just completely stupid, meaningless things, and occasionally killing each other, and you just don't like them. Most of them will be extremely inbred because there's so few of them and they're rich and they don't want to deal with anyone less rich than them, and they spend most of their time. They basically just waste most of their time doing grasp for power at each other and just being annoying, eating excessive food, or getting really advanced spider suits made by Jokero to go down to the lower hives and hunt poor people for sport because they can. This isn't just like one planet. Like, they will hunt people for sport on a lot of different planets. It's not just an issue on Necromunda. Honestly, I don't think that there's a single hive noble in the Imperium that's a decent human being.
Shots fired at Cal Jericho.
Yeah, hive worlds tend to be the poster boys of everything that's wrong with the Imperium, given their poor management and extreme social stratification. Although they're not all bad, I know that contradicts my previous thing, but pre-Civil War Krieg didn't seem to have issues with this. They very well could have because lore is so sparse, but it didn't seem to have the same hive noble issues as other planets, which is a shame because I know that I talked about selection bias, but hive worlds seem to be one of those things where it's just consistently bad in the Imperium, so that is kind of a loss, and hive worlds on Krieg could have been an excellent example of what to be if they were different, which they very well could have been, but very well could not have been. Next up are Forge worlds. These aren't as interesting. They do get some screen time just because people really like the Adeptus Mechanicus, except for when they're pilfering other civilizations. The Adeptus Mechanicus don't really tend to leave their hive worlds that much. And yes, I know there are exceptions, but they, for the most part, stay here. These planets are massive planet-sized factories. Most of them aren't really all that livable just because Adeptus Mechanicus doesn't understand what a EPA is, so they just completely pollute the planet. They don't care about anything outside of it. Some of these planets aren't even breathable, and they just don't even care. They care so little they'd rather just replace their lungs than not do anything. These planets are technically not exactly part of the Imperium. They're actually sovereign because it deals with the machine cult. They will often give technology to others in return for raw resources. For example, there's a hive world that has a trading deal with Catachan because Catachan has special alloys, so they will take in exports of these alloys and in return give back knives made of said alloys while keeping some surplus for themselves to cover production costs. So they do function a lot more like a business, don't necessarily pay tithe, although sometimes it does kind of look like they do. And the only really other notable thing about these is, aside from it being controlled by the Mechanicus, is these planets are often the places where Titan legions are stored, so while rarely deployed, these planets do have stuff like, Apocalyptica ordinances, like the ones used on Armageddon, and then also the aforementioned Titan legions are stored on these planets. Next up are mining worlds. These worlds are pretty much worthless. It's the world where you just don't really need any other designation. Usually these planets tend to be airless or just really poor atmosphere and not really anything of value except for the rocks on them, so they just mine the planets out. These planets tend to be pretty buddy-buddy with the Adeptus Mechanicus because of the aforementioned ore. So these planets do tend to be somewhat better stocked and defended because they trade with the Mechanicus. Mining worlds also tend to be pretty difficult to traverse because the planet is just completely rift upwards towards it's either underground tunnels, which then you have to navigate the basically three-dimensional labyrinth of mining tunnels, or the citizens of the planet will live on massive mining rigs that just tear up the surface of the planet, sort of immortal engine style mixed with those giant digging rigs. So there's very little permanent infrastructure unless you're like full-on tunnels. And the populations of these planets tend to be pretty small, either living on rigs or living in said tunnels. Occasionally these planets will get completely mined out and just abandoned. These planets are pretty rare, but there are some planets where it's literally just tunnels down to the solidified core of the planet and nothing else. Usually abandoned, sometimes taken up by gangs. I think the Loon Wolves had a few engagements on a completely mined out mining world. Next up are shrine worlds. This is what happens when the priest looks at a kilometer-tall church and goes,
"What if we made it bigger?"
These planets tend to be the most beautiful planets with marble buildings, massive statues, and lobotomized babies flying through the air and singing. Yeah, that's a thing. I actually have a couple for tabletop, they're great.
Mine have suicide bombs.
And then, so the beauty of the planets are only really ruined by the people. These planets tend to be populated by the most diehard priests and pilgrims who would willingly flay you alive and burn you if you can't list every page. The Laetitio Divinitatis, which mentions the Emperor's perfect jawline, which is ironic since Filthy Heretic wrote that book, a bunch of lore simps. There's also a subsection called Cemetery Worlds, which are shrine worlds but for dead people, and marble is replaced with human bones. You don't want to be on a shrine world unless you're basically Baka for imps. These worlds also tend to be paradise worlds just because I guess the Imperial Faith has some sway, so they'll try to seize the best worlds for their shrine worlds. Or there'll be worlds where something really important happened, like the Emperor had an engagement personally with enemies on that planet, although that's a lot less common than they just basically co-opted a paradise world. Lastly are fortress worlds. These are worlds that just exist to kill any non-Imperials who touch it, the most famous being Cadia. You know, for Abaddon Dawn, the armless failure broke it after, 13 tries? Krieg is now also one of these fortress worlds where the entire planet is covered in trenches and radiation and is completely fortified up. These planets don't really function as much for tithe, although they do still pay tithe. You know, Cadian and Krieg most notably. These planets do completely pay soldier tithes usually. But these planets are really more valuable not because of what they produce, but just because they deny the enemy that space. For example, Cadian denied the Eye of Terror access to the rest of the galaxy, both through force invading and, unbeknownst to them, the pylons, while Krieg just exists as a thorn waiting for something to make the mistake of landing on it and dying horribly as a result. And then for separate measures of worlds, we have development. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's how technologically advanced the planet is. First is the three designations are feral, feudal, or civilized. Those are the official words of definitions, not my words. So, and obviously there are some development types that are not compatible with different planet types. For example, you won't see a feral forge world unless you want to export to Flintstone cars. It's just not going to happen. So feral worlds are basically worlds where it's cavemen. That's it. People live in caves or tents and are nomadic and haven't really had the agricultural revolution. These planets are only really valuable for either for either raw resources, although that's pretty uncommon just because it's hard to export without technology, or soldiers. For example, the Skull Taker Guard Regiment, which for the record are Cornates. Somebody didn't do their homework for recruiting in the Astra Militarum. So like the Skull Takers literally just put in case and use axes, that's their whole thing. And there's feudal worlds. These worlds are fun. These are basically worlds that are in pre-second millennium, so like pre-2000s, pre-industrial revolution worlds. So these worlds are gonna be like, these are where you get your really cool like space knights or like space renaissance or other stuff like that. And these worlds for some reason tend to have a large amount of knight houses, knights being massive titans, not like, guys walking in armor, although they do also have those in it. And these worlds are probably the most common just because before the reunification, a lot of planets basically regressed an extreme amount in technology by being cut off. And the last is civilized worlds. These are modern or basically imperial standard worlds where they have all the modern technology. They have Promethium, they have full electricity, they have basically all the resources Imperium has and modern technology and can produce better goods like las guns and stuff. And the last test is the environment. Firstly, are dead worlds. These planets have no atmosphere, no life. They tend to end up as mining worlds. It can sometimes be hive worlds, fortresses, or manufactorums, but you have to be self-explanatory. No flora, no fauna. Then there are barren worlds. These are kind of like dead worlds, except they do have an atmosphere. Maybe not a breathable atmosphere, but you're not going to have to worry about solar radiation and stuff, and you have a chance of breathing, although it doesn't really much make sense. Just probably at most, in terms of life, you're going to be like seeing algae or bacteria, which could explain the atmosphere, but it's not required. And barren worlds are pretty much just a slight variation on dead worlds and really should just be a subcategory. Next are normal worlds. These don't have a name or designation just because no one really ever thinks to give them a designation. It's just like, hey, there's nothing notable here. It's just normal breathable air, plants, and animals. But they really should get a status just because it's different than all the other types, even if compared to modern day Earth, it is completely normal. And there's paradise worlds. These are perfect environments, beautiful exotic fruits, beautiful vistas. Most often tropical. These plants are rare and highly coveted. And most are the result of Golden Age eco-engineering, although they could hypothetically naturally occur, but you're just not really going to see these at all. And the lastly and most famous are death worlds. These worlds are the most well known because of the selection bias. Most death worlds also share another status planet, and you do not want to live on these planets as they are too hostile to support colonization. Whether it's a desert that bakes you alive and strips your flesh from your bones with windstorms, a frozen wasteland that causes you to freeze from the inside out if you breathe outside air, or a jungle where every animal and plant is toxic and will eat you, you do not want to be here. These planets tend to be pretty common in lore because of the aforementioned selection bias, and these planets produce a lot of guard just because it's hard to really produce anything else on these planets. However, these planets also do serve as recruiting grounds for space marines for the same reasons that the guard. That's pretty much all I need to know for a primer of the planets of the Imperium. I'll probably run another poll on my Twitter if you want to see more, just upvote on that. If you're curious about more on the history of specific planets, I'll probably do an option of a poll talking about guard regiments and their history as well as their planets. As for Chaos Gods, I'll probably pop one of them in the poll, and feel free to comment with whatever you want to hear about. And for the record, that's not like me trying to trick people into commenting, because I'm so tired of where they'll purposely say something controversial and go,
What is that? Comment.
Yeah, I hate that because it's just people trying to force interaction, which is the same reason why I'm no longer trying to put the whole like and subscribe thing in my videos, because I just hate that, and I don't know why, but everyone does it. You don't need to tell them to like and subscribe. People are smart enough to do that on their own. So if you ever hear me doing that, from here on out, I have done in past videos just because that's the thing everyone does, but for now on out, I'm not going to be doing that. So yeah, if you like this type of video, feel free to let me know, and I'll try to do more of this type of video in the future. Don't worry, I'll still be doing my more classic style of gaming videos and doing gameplay uploads, hopefully with mic on and internet working and all that. I probably won't be doing webcam for a while just because I'm still trying to figure out a way where I can do that without completely making the video unusable on everything else. So yeah, that's basically it. Yeah.